Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 13.1 on coevolution and mutualisms. So if we think back to the species interactions that we've been talking about, you remember that those interactions are categorized according to the effect that each species has on the other. Coevolution is a special case of a species interaction where you have two species that affect each other's evolutionary trajectory in a reciprocal fashion via natural selection and a type of an arms race. So what this means is that you have two species who have an interaction, and as one evolves, the other one has to continue evolving. So this is called the Red Queen hypothesis, and it comes from the book Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. And the quote is, "Now here you see it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." And the idea is that if you have a predator and its prey, that predator and that prey have to continually evolve to be able to stay one step ahead of the other. So if you think about an example of like a jackrabbit and a coyote, the jackrabbit has to be able to run really quickly to be able to get away from the coyote. So then the coyote evolves to be able to run faster and catch the rabbit. So now the rabbit evolves some sort of evasive maneuvers and things like that to be able to evade the coyote. So now the coyote evolves behaviors that allow it to be more sneaky. And so the rabbits start having to have new behaviors to be able to evade the coyote. And so they have this continual evolution where the evolution of one species affects the evolution of the other to allow them to stay ahead of each other. And so it's this idea that you keep running and running, you have to keep evolving to stay in the same place, to stay one step ahead of your predator or your parasites or whatever it is. You have to keep evolving, you have to keep moving to stay ahead in this arms race of evolution and natural selection. So coevolution doesn't only occur when we're talking about predators and prey. It can also occur when we're talking about something like an herbivore. So different birds have beaks that are shaped appropriately for the type of food that they eat. If you think about like a hummingbird, hummingbirds have long, slender beaks that they are able to suck nectar out of the deep wells of certain types of flowers, and certain flowers that are adapted to being pollinated by hummingbirds, like honeysuckle, have a sort of long, narrow flower that only that hummingbird can access. And so through time, they have evolved simultaneously to be able to allow pollination only by that one species. So let's talk about a really classic example of coevolution, which is in feral rabbits that were introduced to Australia. So rabbits are not native to Australia, and a few rabbits were introduced to a ranch in Victoria, Australia, which is in southern Australia, in the 1800s. They were introduced so that the farmers, the ranchers, would have something to shoot at for sport. And so when these rabbits were introduced, they were put into an environment that had no predators, no competition, and sort of unlimited resources because of this. So we just talked about population growth and exponential growth. So you can imagine that if you put rabbits, which multiply very quickly, they have several litters of babies a year, and they can have many, many babies in each litter. So you can imagine that this rabbit population exploded really, really quickly. And within a few years, there were hundreds of millions of rabbits that were all over the continent of Australia. And they destroyed pasture lands, and they were threatening wool production because there were so many that they were competing with sheep for access to grass. And so they were eventually hurting the economy of Australia. To combat this, scientists introduced the myxoma virus in the 1950s, And this is a virus that's spread by mosquitoes, and it will only infect rabbits. And it proved to be a really effective biological control agent where it was able to kill 99.8% of the infected rabbit. Later, there were more outbreaks after this where the virus was less successful. So let's talk about why this might be. So in coevolution, you have both the rabbits and the virus evolving through time. So up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you have a figure that shows something that should be really familiar to you at this point, where you have natural selection occurring. So you have at the beginning a population with a lot of genetic diversity. There's some type of a selective event, and afterwards that diversity has been reduced because only individuals that were able to survived and then reproduce and create the final population. In this case, only the rabbits that had a natural high resistance level to the virus were able to survive. And so in this case, you had a decline in the lethality of the myxoma virus in Australia that resulted from an evolutionary response in both the rabbit and the virus populations. So in this case, there were genetic factors that conferred a resistance to the disease that existed in the rabbit population prior to the introduction of the myxoma virus. After that virus was introduced to that population, you end up with a group of rabbits that can't easily be killed by the virus, and those are the ones that have survived and are reproducing and passing their genes on to the next generation. So the myxoma epidemic exerted a strong selective pressure for resistance, and eventually most of the surviving rabbit population consisted of resistant animals. And therefore, as you can imagine, the number of rabbits increased again because now these rabbits cannot be killed by this virus. On the other hand, there's evolution happening at the same time through coevolution in the virus. So that evolution happened in a similar way where there's selection and you end up with a virus that looks a little bit different than the original. So most viruses, when they're new, have a really high virulence, which means that they're very deadly. But if you think about sort of the purpose of a virus, its purpose is to infect new hosts. So if you have an incredibly virulent strain of a virus and it kills its host really quickly before it can reproduce and infect other hosts, that strain is not going to survive. So over time, viruses are selected to be a little bit more benign and less deadly because they are unable to survive and be passed on to new hosts if they're very deadly. So over time, the myxoma virus became less and less deadly because it was selected to have a more benign strain rather than those more virulent strains. So through time, you had evolution of rabbits becoming more resistant to the virus, and you also had evolution of the virus to become less deadly so that that virus could actually survive and pass its genes on. Another example of coevolution is in heliconius butterflies and passion vines. Heliconius butterflies are a group of butterflies that live in Central and South America. This may sound familiar because we talked about them when we were talking about aposematic coloration, where all of these butterflies have similar markings that warn predators that they are toxic. So they're all black, red, yellow, orange, those sorts of colors that serve as warnings that they are unpalatable. So the larvae of these butterflies all eat passion vine leaves, and each species of butterfly uses a different species of passion vine as a food plant. So the species of butterfly have all become very specialized to specific types of different species of the passion vine. And those passion vines all have different toxins in their leaves, and the butterflies are able to tolerate those toxins if they're eating the correct type of passion vine. So the passion vines have also had evolution occurring, and they have created defenses against the butterflies and their larvae. So they have defensive chemicals in their leaves, but the butterflies have adapted to actually integrate those chemicals into their bodies to make them toxic to predators. So the passion vines have evolved toxins, but butterflies have then evolved the ability to integrate those into their bodies. Passion vines also have trichomes on their leaves, which are sort of little spikes. And so it would be difficult for like a small squishy caterpillar to walk on the leaves because they would be getting poked constantly by these little spikes on the leaves. They also will have fake eggs that they develop on their leaves that make it look like their leaves already have butterfly eggs laid on them, and that is meant to deter a female butterfly from laying her eggs on that same leaf, because if those eggs are already there, they're going to hatch before the new female's eggs, and they're going to then eat the entire leaf before her eggs are able to hatch. So the passion vines have evolved these fake eggs that they will develop on their leaves to try to deter the butterflies. The passion vines have also evolved different and really unique leaf shapes to avoid being detected as a larval food source by the butterflies. So they look very unusual in terms of their shapes to try to look like something that is not something that the female would want to lay her eggs on. And so you can see how through time, and these two species have co-evolved with each other, and they've clearly been in coevolution with each other for a very long time because there's been enough time for each of them to create defenses against the other, and then new ways to defend themselves. And so you can see that this has been going on for a very long time between these two species. Another really cool example of coevolution is with leafcutter ants and their fungus, which sounds strange, but let me explain it. So ants, leafcutter ants will go and collect leaves and caterpillar poop, but they don't eat the leaves. They actually take the leaves back to their nest and they feed it to a fungus that they grow in that nest. And the ants eat the fungal fruiting bodies from that fungus when it fruits. So the ants go out and collect food to feed to the fungus that they have in like a fungal garden in their nest. And when a queen is born and then leaves to make her own nest, she'll actually take a chunk of that fungus to the location where she's going to make a new nest, and put it there to start growing it. And so if you think about it, you can't usually just grow one microbe without growing some others. And one thing that can happen is that a pathogenic bacteria that's called Ascovopsis grows as well sometimes, and it is able to kill the fungus because there are some bacteria that can kill different kinds of fungi. So the ants actually have a white patch on their chest where they grow antibiotic producing bacteria on their own bodies. And so if that pathogenic bacteria shows up in their nest, they're able to apply it to the fungus and kill off that harmful bacteria with the protective bacteria that they've grown on their body. So the actinobacteria kill the Ascovopsis and it protects their food fungus. And so through that, there's been a coevolution where there's the evolution of them using this food source and then a possible pathogen for it, and then the ants have evolved a way to protect their food from that pathogen. So I also encourage you to go back and watch these two videos because they're very, very cool with more information on this. So as far as species interactions, there is a special type of species interaction where both species within that interaction benefit, and that type of interaction is called a mutualism. So interactions between species that benefit both participants are called mutualisms, and some mutualisms lead to coevolution, but many do not. So coevolution applies only to reciprocal evolutionary responses between pairs of populations. So a good example of this are acacia ants, which live on acacia plants. So the acacia ants live on these plants and they protect the plants from preying insects that would eat parts of the plant and other plants that are trying to compete for sunlight. So they'll go and they'll kill other insects or eat other plants that are trying to compete with the acacia plant for access to sunlight. In return, the plant does a few nice things for the ant. So it has these little fruiting bodies on them. They're called Beltian bodies, and those are created by the plant simply to feed the ants. So they make these special little fruits that only the ants eat, and they do that in exchange for the ants helping protect the plant. They also have little places on the plant that secrete nectar, and the ants eat that nectar. And then they also have very large spiky thorns that keep large herbivores from eating the acacia plants, but those thorns are hollow, and the ants actually use them as nests for their eggs and their young. So the ants will go inside of those thorns, and that's a protected place for them to have their babies. So they've had this coevolution between the acacia plants and the acacia ants, where they are now in a mutualistic relationship that allows both of them to benefit. The other picture on the slide, which is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, is a different species of ant, and the little insect in front of it is called a tree hopper. And so the ant sort of takes care of the tree hopper. If it rains, it moves it out of the way. It takes care of it and protects it. And in return, when the tree hopper eats something, it will secrete extra nutrients out of its back end, and the ant will eat those nutrients as a way to get excess sugars and things from it. So they have a mutually beneficial relationship between the ant and the tree hopper. So when we're talking about species that are involved in a mutualism, they usually have complementary functions. So each party is specialized to perform a complementary function for the other one. And a highly co-evolved mutualism is seen in lichens, where you have a partnership between an algae and a fungi. So such intimate associations where you have the members form a distinctive entity are examples of symbioses or a symbiosis. So a lichen is made up of fungi and algae. So a lichen has three different layers. The top layer is called the cortex. The bottom layer is called the medulla. Those two layers are fungi. The middle layer is the algal layer. So the top layer is the fungus, and it's usually very clear, and so the sunlight can get down to the algae. And the bottom layer, the medulla, has a lot of hyphae and things like that, so it can attach to structures and absorb nutrients from whatever it's dissolving. The algal layer does photosynthesis and creates sugars that feed the fungus. And so the fungus is creating a protective layer for the algae, and in return, the algae is producing glucose and things through photosynthesis. And so they have a completely codependent relationship where one cannot survive without the other. So lichens are an example of a trophic mutualism. A trophic mutualism is a mutualism where you have partners that are specialized for obtaining energy and nutrients. So you typically have each partner that's supplying a limited nutrient or energy source that the other can't obtain by itself. So here's a couple of other examples of trophic mutualisms. The first one are rhizobium and plant roots that form nitrogen-fixing root nodules. So rhizobium are bacteria that are able to convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that can be taken up by plants. Nitrogen is usually a limiting resource in any terrestrial ecosystem. So any way that plants can get extra nitrogen is going to be beneficial for the plant. So there are certain types of plants called legumes, which are peas and beans, that have special nodules in their roots that are that create a safe place for these bacteria to live. So the bacteria live in these root nodules, and in return, they do nitrogen fixation, where they convert that atmospheric nitrogen to a usable form, which benefits the plants. So they have a trophic mutualism between them. Another example are cows and other ruminants, which have a cellulose digesting bacteria that live in the rumens of their digestive systems. So cows and other things that mainly eat grass and plant material aren't actually able to break down cellulose, which is plant material. Instead, they have archaea, which are methanogens, that live in their guts, and when they chew up and swallow plant material, those archaea are able to then break down that cellulose and release that energy so that the cows can digest it. So the cows give the bacteria or the archaea a nice, warm, safe place to live in their stomachs, and in return, they break down the food material for the cows that the cows can't digest for themselves. There are also defensive mutualisms where you have species receiving food or shelter from their partners in return for a defensive function. So that defensive function may protect one partner against herbivores or predators or parasites. An example of this are hippos, which have a mutualistic relationship with oxpeckers, which are the bird. So it's the bird sitting on top of this hippo's head. So hippos spend quite a bit of time in the water, but they're not in the water all the time. And when they're not in the water, they can get bugs and ticks and other things that live on the outside of their bodies. And so the oxpecker lives on or hangs out on the head or the back of the hippo, and it eats those insects and parasites off of the hippo's body. So the bird is getting a free meal, and the hippo is getting cleaned of parasites. Another example are moray eels, which have a mutualistic relationship with what's called a cleaner shrimp. So cleaner shrimps will walk around the external part of the eel and remove dead skin and parasites from the eel's body. So the shrimp is getting a free meal, and the eel is getting cleaned and rid of its parasites. Another example of a defensive mutualism is the one we've already talked about, which are the acacia ants and the acacia plants, where you have the plant providing food and shelter for the ants, and in return, the ants are keeping insects and other things away from the plant that could harm it. There are also what we call dispersive mutualisms, and these are where you have pollination mutualisms between flowers and their pollinators that allow the transport of pollen in return for rewards like nectar and excess pollen. So these mutualisms tend to be more specialized because it's in the plant's interest that the pollen be transferred to another plant of the same species. So at least 3 aspects of flowers appear to be co-evolved between flowering plants and insects, because they involve communication between plants and their pollinators. So the first one is that flowers communicate with their pollinators by scent. So the insects use the scent to determine how far away a flower is, to approach it, and to identify where to land and finally where to feed. Flowers also attract insects with patterns or stripes that lead to the reward of nectar and pollen. And the colors like blue and ultraviolet, because insect eyes are sensitive to those colors, insects see in UV. And in contrast, bird-pollinated flowers tend to be red or orange because those are colors that birds are sensitive to. A third way is that flowers, like some types of orchids, mimic females of particular insects, and therefore they deceive males into coming to those flowers because they think that they're going there to copulate with a female of their species, when in reality it's a flower. So they're tricking the males into coming to their flowers. So plants don't only have mutualisms to be pollinated, they also have mutualisms with certain types of animals to allow their seeds to be dispersed. So plants can't easily run around and put their seeds in other places that would be good for them to grow. So a lot of them have mutualistic relationships with different types of animals to disperse their seeds far away from the parent plant, where there's not going to be a lot of competition. So ants harvest seeds, and some of them have what are called elaiosomes, which are sort of nutritious fruity structures on the outsides of the seeds. And so the ants will take the entire elaisome back to their nest, and they will eat the entire elaisome, and then they'll discard the seed in the middle. And so in that way, they end up discarding that seed so that it can grow somewhere far away from the parent plant. Elephants are a very important disperser of marula seeds. So elephants eat the fruit from a marula tree. So it's a big, very good smelling fruit, and so the elephants actually eat them whole. And so when the elephant defecates, the seeds are dispersed with a pile of fertilizer in the form of the elephant feces, and then that seed is able to grow. And those marula seeds are actually completely dependent on the elephant digestive system to break down the outer coat of it, as well as the fertilizer that is in the feces of that elephant. So the last slide is a video of Dr. Dan Jansen, who is the scientist who discovered and described the mutualism and coevolution of acacia ants and acacia plants. So go back and watch this. There's no better place to learn about this mutualism than from the scientist who discovered it.